Alright, so let's have like a little discussion. Something that always gets really heated on the internet, which I find absolutely hilarious. We're going to talk about which sword is better. So you've got your long sword, your sort of European straight sword, or you've got the samurai sword. Okay, yeah, these aren't real, they're just practice ones. But we're going to be discussing which one of these two swords is better because, contrary to popular belief, neither one's actually better than the other. They're just different weapons for different situations and from different cultures. And to be fair, between the two cultures, there's a lot of overlap, which we're going to be discussing and talking about how people's biases on these weapons. You know, they're either ignorant or sometimes even racist. So we're going to be talking about that. So let's, start off with the samurai sword with a few disclaimers. I mean, the first one, that this beautiful, elegant weapon is the most sharp sword in the world, that it can cut through anything. Is it the sharpest sword in the world? I don't know. Maybe one. One katana is the sharpest sword in the world. Doesn't mean they're all the sharpest sword in the world. You can get some pretty shitty katanas. In terms of its cutting power, yeah, it does cut better than the straight sword. I'm not going to lie about that. That's because it's got a curved edge. It's not because it's magical. It's made of the same, similar if not the same materials as the straight sword. It just has a curved edge, which means it is superior at cutting. If you really want to see swords that are badass at cutting, they're also made with brilliant edges and brilliant metalwork. You need to look at the Middle East. It's made from folded steel. That is true, but the Celts were folding steel in like 600 BC, and as I said, metallurgy from the Middle East. You look at Damascus steel, stuff like that. That was way more advanced than anything Japan was producing. I think a lot of people, the reason they think he's cut so nicely is from pop culture, from seeing all the videos of like anime where they cut people in half, movies and stuff like that. And you could definitely cut someone's head off with this thing. I'm not going to kid about that. A real one with a bit of weight behind it and a nice sharp edge, the curved blade, there you can cut a head off. But let's not say, you can cut a head off with this. The katana definitely cuts better than the straight sword. But then that leads us on to the straight sword. The straight sword, looking at the shape of that, you think this is going to do better than that. It's going to stab better in there. Pretty simple. It's much better for stabbing. It's more versatile, I find, in combat. You can find a lot more angles. You can strike with the other side. But even so, I still really like the katana. I feel that the large cross grip sometimes, the way I hold it, bearing in mind I don't have as much formal training in either one of these weapons. I definitely have more formal training with the katana than I do with a straight sword. I find the cross guard can get in the way of my grip sometimes if I'm trying to play around with flurries and everything like that. I think the reason people like to look at these weapons very differently is, as I said, it's people like to romanticize the Far East. Like, things from the Far East are very elegant, mystified. The samurai were very regal people, very gentrified, very cultured. But really, when you do a bit of research, samurai weren't all that different from medieval knights. They lived by a code. You had the code of Bushido, and you had the code of chivalry. And there was a lot of overlap. They were very, knights were people raised in the world of martial arts. They were raised to be warriors. They trained to fight from a young age. They served their lords. They served the gods. Is that any different than, than a samurai? Really, is it any different to a samurai? You would have served his lord, would have adhered to the code of Bushido, code of honor, always trained in martial arts from a young age. And the truth is as well, with these two weapons, they were never really the main weapons that a knight or a samurai would choose. These were more seen as, at least in the time period, if you look at a lot of martial history, they were more like sidearms. They'd be more, a knight or a samurai might have these sort of put down in their holster and be using a spear or a bow or a crossbow, whatever weapon it would have been from the period. Hell, samurais even used guns, so just keep that in mind. I think a good comparison between two weapons like these is, rather than thinking of them as better than one another, they're both swords, so yes, we can compare them, but a good comparison to make would be like when you compare guns. Isn't AK-47 better than an M4. I'm sure there are some people that will lean towards one side or the other. You know, the M4, it's more versatile. It can be, you can put different grips on it, different sights. It can be chambered in a multitude of ways. It can be this, that, the other, blah, 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 blah. People are going to favour the M4 for whatever reason that may be. But then you've got people that prefer the AK, it's more reliable. It can be done with this. You can change the barrel and the stock and stuff and create entirely new weapons. It can be chambered in a multitude of ways. It's again down to sort of personal preference. Talking of the metal used, a lot of people talk about how folded steel was used to create katanas, and this made them razor sharp. But folded steel was often used in the West as well. And if I'm not mistaken, Kagahami, which I believe is one of the metals they used to create katanas, in the West was referred to as pig iron. It was considered too low quality to be made swords with. And what a lot of the time you find is the metal used to make samurai swords. Yes, I am calling them samurai swords. It's a fucking joke because I know people get wound up. They tended to be a lot more brittle from what I've seen. They would tend to snap around this point in the weapon. You struck a point really hard straight down, rather than, I believe, the traditional technique is to sort of draw the blade towards you as you strike, as opposed to just a smack. It would cause the tip to snap. Whereas longswords tended to bend a lot more than katanas would. And as I said, you know, the metallurgy from each time period was quite different, and neither one of them was particularly better than the other one. It was just more suited to the need. You know, I'm sure a lord who had the money to spend his katana, you know, even if he used a katana, he might have preferred using an adachi, which is like the two-handed variant, you know, and same with a knight. A knight might use this is like a bastard sword, or a hand-and-a-half sword, or a long sword. You know, there's a million different names for a similar type of sword. At the time period, a lot of the time, swords weren't distinguished like, oh, this is a gladius from Hispania, so it's called an Hispanic gladius or whatever. They would have just called it a sword. Oh, it's a one-handed sword. Oh, it's a two-handed sword. But in this case, a hand-and-a-half sword or a bastard sword. They weren't as strict on their definitions because it didn't matter as much in those time periods. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. A lord with a katana, his metal that he would have been able to buy in craftsmanship would have been much higher quality than like your working man. And that goes for the longsword as well. You know, a king would have a much higher quality sword than your average run-of-the-mill bloke. And chances are that, you know, good quality steel was probably hard to come by for either culture, for the common man. So you'd probably only see high quality weapons in the knighthoods or the samurai sort of stuff like that. In terms of the way people fought with these, it's quite interesting because you'll find videos of, you know, HEMA practitioners versus kendo. Kendo has survived as a form of Japanese fencing, has survived until this day and age. The only problem with when HEMA faces against kendo is kendo is very, they bop, and they poke, and they bop, and stuff like that, and it's with very light bamboo sticks that they're doing these strikes with. And you compare that to HEMA. When HEMA practitioners fight, first of all, the only way to score is when they get their whole body into a strike. Their whole weight has to go into it. It has to be graded as like a strike that would have caused damage. And the weapons they use very typically tend to be metal, which replicates the weight. So a lot of the time, in my experience, when you're watching these, there's probably, you know, just as many videos of HEMA practitioners beating kendo practitioners. But a lot of the time, you'll find the kendo people, in my experience, they tend to win in quotations. They tend to land a lot more points, just because, as I said, the point scoring system is very different. It's tap, you know, a tap on the head for a kendo practitioner would count as a win. You know, whereas in HEMA, if he was to tap him on the head, that wouldn't win. It would need to be a strike to the throat, somewhere weak in the armour. You know, because you tap him on the head, that's where it counts. It'd have to be in the throat or a thrust, something like that. So very different types of martial arts. But if you actually look at Japanese practitioners who practice, don't know what, is it kenjutsu? Don't know what you'd call it, but the older school of fencing, full contact fencing, that you'd see where, you know, I'll put some videos in where you see blokes with spears trying to defend against guys with swords, and they all fight the same, guys. You know, there's no, when you look at martial arts, everyone in the whole world, we're all humans. We have two legs, two arms. Unless you got like, you're built like Goro, you're all gonna fight the same. Okay, so when knights and samurais would get in close with these swords, chances are they'd drop them, they'd grapple, the knives would come out, they'd be looking to get the finishing blow with the knife through the armour. The armour was really, really functional, guys. It worked really nicely. You know, you had your spear, which kept people away, but once that spear's out of the way and you're getting in, even with the sword, knocking the sword out of the way, getting in too close, throwing someone on the ground, getting the knife out would be a lot more effective. I think the most interesting difference culturally between knights and samurai is in Western society, if someone surrendered, sparing their life was considered the very honourable thing to do. That was considered the chivalrous thing to do, the code of chivalry. Whereas the code of Bushido, the honourable thing to do is never surrender. Or if someone did, you would take their life and give them back their honour. I think that's just an interesting point. But in terms of these two, which one's better than the other? They're just sharpened pieces of metal for hitting people. You know, one's not better than the other. It's about who's using them. It's about the individual sword itself, the quality of the sword. You know, swords aren't like guns, I'm afraid, where, you know, especially back in the day, they weren't like mass produced in a way. A lot of the time, I believe, you know, the Romans might have mass produced theirs, and other cultures that are similar to the Romans. But I think samurais and knights are actually quite comparable and very, very similar. And I think people need to let go of that whole fact of, you know, one's better than the other, because that's just unfair bias. And as I said, in summary, yeah, this is better at cutting, this is better at stabbing. Which one would I rather use in a fight? You know, I'm kind of leaning more towards this one, you know, just because I like how you can slide stuff off the blade and into your boss, but I can still do that with the straight sword. You know, now I'm thinking, would I use the straight sword? So it's as simple as that, you know. It probably just depends on your mood on the day. But I think it's majorly important that you don't choose biases between the two.